Okay, our overall topic, a strong start for the nation. Our first subtopic will be the election of 1789, choosing a leader for the new United States of America. So a strong start for the nation. The first subtopic will be the election of 1789, choosing a leader for the new United States of America. This will be the first of many presidential elections you'll learn about in the next 2 years. Now, when it came time to choose a leader for this newly formed United States of America, members of Congress really had two issues that had to be dealt with. Okay? So when time came to choose a leader for this newly formed United States of America, members of Congress, the Continental Congress, had two issues they had to deal with. First of all, what is the Continental Congress used to as far as leadership? They're accustomed to a monarchy. Okay, what's a monarchy, Alexa? You know what that is? By virtue of their bloodline. Okay, so you have a king and a queen, and then you inherit the leadership because of bloodline. That's what they're used to. They're not used to having somebody rule that isn't in a monarchy. We don't have a king and a queen. Okay? And then how do you replace the king and the queen with their children? How do you replace them with their children? So it didn't matter if you were a good leader or not. You just assumed the head of the country through monarchy. That's what they were used to, and they're going to have to get that out of their mind. Now, you also have to understand that Congress had no national government experience. How did each colony run itself during this time? Individually. So did we have an overall government ever? No. Each colony ran their own government. So Congress has no governmental experience. All of their experience of ruling comes from colonial, or now they would be known as state governments. Okay? Nobody ever ruled the whole place. Okay? So those are some problems they had to overcome. They were only used to a monarchy where rulers came as a result of bloodline, and they had absolutely no national government experience. All their experience came from colonial or now state government rule. Now, another discussion that came out in Congress is how much power is this new president going to have? How much power are we going to give this new president that we're going to elect? Now, kiddos, this is what starts the problem that you may consider we had in the election of 2017. The Electoral College is now developed in history by Congress. And what the Continental Congress did this time is they developed what would be known as the Electoral College voting, which gave each state a certain number of electors determined by the number of congressmen each state had. This is where the electoral vote came from, kiddos. That was a little bit of an issue this year because whether you liked it or not, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote in the election of 2017, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College, or the electoral vote. This is where it all started, was right here in 1789, when the Continental Congress decided they would start what we know as the Electoral College, where your state would receive a certain number of electoral votes determined by the number of representatives you had in Congress. Is that the same way it is now? How many representatives does Wyoming have in Congress? 3. How many electoral votes is Wyoming worth in election? 3. Whereas I don't know the exact number on this. Someone like California might have 30 congressmen and senators, and they have 30 electoral votes. That's how this was all set up in 1789. Now, something else that was interesting at this time. At this time, Congress believed that they should vote on the president, as many people within the colonies would not know who the presidential candidates were. So again, that's why Congress was voting. So if you think about this, the Electoral College was first set up that the representatives would vote. Because a lot of people in the United States didn't even know who the presidential candidates were. This isn't like today when you had television and campaign ads. You think some colonial resident that lived over here has any idea who the presidential candidates are going to be over in this area at the time? No. So that was another reason why Congress justified the Electoral College, is because they believed that they being Congress, should vote for president, because the people couldn't do that. They don't even know what's going on. Okay? So on February 4th of 1789, these congressmen met in their respective states. And when they met in their respective states, they cast ballots for President of the United States. So do you understand that the people did not vote in the first election? That the congressmen did. They voted. They got together on February 4th, 1789. These congressmen, also known as electors, met in their respective states and cast ballots for, quote, President of the United States. Now, at this time, this is another weird thing they agreed upon that isn't the case now. They simply agreed on these three boys, Andy, Peyton, and Charles, are running for president. They have no political party affiliation at this time. They're just three guys that want to be president. So what they voted on, the Continental Congress, is the top vote getter would be president, and the second top vote getter would be vice president. There were no parties. There were no people running together, which could cause you problems, which we'll talk about. So it was agreed upon that the person who received the most of the votes of the electors would be president, and the runner-up would be vice president. Now, it just so happened, when the electors voted, George Washington received all of the electoral votes in this first election. There was nobody that received any others, and so he was elected president. Okay? Unanimously. Nobody else voted for anybody else but him. And that was called the first ballot. So the electors voted, and normally they would say, well, Andy has so many votes, Charles has so many, and Peyton has so many. So Andy's the president, Charles the vice president. Just so happened in this first election, every one of the representatives, the congressmen, voted for George Washington. So they had to go to a second ballot to vote for what? Vice president. Okay, so they went to a second ballot, and John Adams received the most on the second ballot, and as a result of that became the nation's first vice president. Okay, John Adams. Now, prior to this, even though I've said this, they didn't really know what they were going to call this person. I'm just telling you they were voting for President of the United States so you understand. But after the ballot was taken, was the controversy of what would the official title be of this person that is going to lead our country. Now, John Adams preferred that that person be called His Majesty the President. Instead of the President of the United States, John Adams wanted it to be called, you're elected to His Majesty the President. Well, George Washington did not feel comfortable with that title. Now, where does that come from? His Majesty.
The king and queen.
What's that?
Kings and queens.
The monarchy rule. Yeah, so they were still kind of used to that. So again, John Adams wanted to call it His Majesty the President. Not the President of the United States, His Majesty the President. Well, George Washington didn't feel comfortable with that because in a monarchy, His Majesty was required to shake hands with everyone when introduced. So if I was introduced in this room as His Majesty the President, I would have to go over and shake Alexa's hand, and then McKenna's hand, and then Julie's hand, and Lisa's hand, and he didn't like shaking hands that much, to be quite honest with you. So he was uncomfortable with that. He didn't like shaking so many hands. So he insisted on the title, His Excellency the President. Okay? Because His Majesty meant he had to shake hands. So George Washington was uncomfortable with shaking so many hands, so he insisted on the title, His Excellency the President. Any questions on that subtopic? We'll see where that His Excellency goes to. Okay? That'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is the inauguration of the nation's first president. The inauguration of the nation's first president. On April 30th of 1789, on April 30th of 1789, by the way, anybody want to guess where the capital city of America was at that date? No?
Just Virginia.
Nope.
Probably somewhere in Boston.
Boston.
What?
Boston.
New York City.
Oh, I thought there
On April 30th, 1789, a crowd gathered at a pretty famous street in the capital city of New York City. Anybody guess what street that was? A lot of now. Wall Street. They met on Wall Street in the capital city of New York City to witness the inauguration of the first president of the United States. On April 30th, 1789, a crowd gathered at Wall Street in the capital city of New York City for the inauguration of the first president of the United States. Now, let's think about this. As Washington took the oath of office, considering the task ahead of him, what might he be thinking about? What thoughts might be passing through his mind?
What am I doing?
Well, maybe what am I doing? What's one of the things that Congress had a hard time grasping? Each colony, right? So, one of the things going through his mind is, how in the world am I going to transform 13 separate states into one federal government? Because they're used to doing things as they please within their own colony/state. So one thing going through his mind is, how in the world am I going to create a federal government in which I get 13 separate entities to think as one? The second thing that went through his mind is, if I'm able to do this, if I'm able to transform 13 separate states into a federal government, what are the chances that thing's going to succeed? What are the chances this new federal government's going to succeed if I even get it going? And if I get it going, how long is it going to last once I establish it? So as one of his thoughts was, how am I going to turn these 13 separate states into one federal government? If I do, what are the chances that's going to work? And if it does work, how long is it going to work for? I mean, this would be kind of an awesome responsibility to put this thing together. And Josh might be right. He might be thinking, and what did I get myself into here? Right? Well, basically when you think about it, it's going to be the responsibility of His Excellency the President and Congress to create an entire new nation. Out of scratch, basically. They're going to have to establish a new nation. Now, they upped the ante in Congress. They elected more congressmen in this election of 1789. So here's what the newly created Congress looked like. Is it the Continental Congress now? No, it's the United States Congress. And here's what it looked like after the election of 1789. How many states do we have? 13. So they elected 2 senators from each state, which meant that there would be 26 senators in the new Congress. 2 senators from each state. Is that the way it is today?
No, it goes off by population.
What goes up by population?
Don't you get like a senator per...
How many senators you get?
2 houses of Congress.
House and Senate.
House and Senate. Which one's based on population? Would it be fair if every single state didn't have the same number of senators? No. Each state has 2 senators. But the representatives is based on population. Okay? Now at this time there were 59 representatives from various states. Okay, so there were 26 senators, 2 from each state. How many senators does Wyoming have?
2.
Okay, they have 2. How many does New York have? 2. But representatives is a whole different game, okay? So the new Congress consists of 26 senators, 2 from each state, and 59 representatives, obviously from various states. Some states are going to have more than others based on population. Okay, so we have a President of the United States, and we have a Congress. That takes us to our next subtopic, which is creating a presidential cabinet. Creating a presidential cabinet. Now, Washington's the one that came up with the bright idea that he would need advisors to assist him with his responsibilities as president. He knew he couldn't do it all himself. So Washington decides to go to Congress and say, hey, I need some help. I need some advisors. I need some assistance to help me run this new country and get it organized. And so Congress created 4 departments to help President Washington with his work. So after President Washington's inauguration, he thought he needed advisors to assist him with his responsibilities as president. And as a result, Congress creates 4 departments to help him with his work. We're going to talk about 3 of those. Anybody want to guess what the first of any of the departments were that might kind of work with today? What? Well, that's everybody's in the executive. What's the department? What do we have today? What do we have today? What? Oh, we're not there yet. We're going to get to that though. We haven't figured that out yet. The court system in this deal. Department of what?
Justice.
Well, that's a little bit before. Just 3 basic ones. You guys are pitiful. That's why we do this. How about the Department of State? Okay, the Department of State that was created in 1789 is the same Department of State that's running today. And what does the Department of State do? It helps the president handle foreign and domestic affairs. What's a domestic affair? Inside the country. A foreign affair is something outside the country. So it created a Department of State to help the president handle both foreign and domestic affairs. What else now? Come on, I got you on a roll. Department of the... What's it called? Who runs our money in this country? Department of what? What? Department of the Treasury. Department of the Treasury. And that's going to help the president with financial issues within the nation. Same as it does today. So Department of State, Department of the Treasury. Now come on, what do we have now that protects this country? The Department of what? Defense. At that time, though, it was called the Department of War. And that did not change till the Department of Defense until 1947. This country ran out with the Department of War from 1789 to 1947. It was in 1947 during the Harry Truman administration that it was changed to the Department of Defense. But it's the Department of War. And that was to help the president with the 3 M's, manage military matters. So Congress created 3 departments to help President Washington with his work. The Department of State to help the president handle both foreign and domestic affairs. 2, the Department of the Treasury to help the president with financial issues within the nation. And 3, the Department of War to help the president manage military matters. Now, each department had a head of the department, so to speak. And those people became known as members of the president's cabinet. They were made up of his top advisors, including the department heads of the Department of State, Treasury, and War. But what did they call them instead of department heads? You have a Secretary of State, a Secretary of the Treasury, a Secretary of Defense, still like you do today. So those department heads in each of those departments became known as secretaries, and they met with the president in both informal and formal meetings. So you're going to have a Secretary of State for Washington, a Secretary of the Treasury, a Secretary of War. Now, these fellows that were in the president's cabinet served in an advisory role. Who did the final decision rest with, and still does today? The President of the United States. So even today we have all these departments. Department of Health and Welfare, Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of this, the Department of that. They all have secretaries. Cabinets are big now. Okay? Give you an idea. Here's a list of President Eisenhower's cabinet. He had a Secretary of State, a Secretary of the Treasury, a Secretary of Defense, an Attorney General, a Postmaster General, a Secretary of Agriculture, a Secretary of the Interior, a Secretary of Commerce, a Secretary of Labor, a Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. That's what it's changed to. And all these men served in those capacities. This is a sheet that tells you that he had a dysfunctional administration because of all the changes in the cabinet. President Trump right now has had multiple changes in his cabinet. Okay? People have changed. So you have to think about that. So those are people that helped the president with decisions, but the final decision always rests with the president. Now, getting back to what Josh says, this president's cabinet would be referred to as the executive department. And I'm going to give you the most significant 4 members of Washington's cabinet. Okay, these are known as the executive department. Any person in President Trump's cabinet is part of the executive department of the United States government. But I'm going to tell you the top 4. These 4 would eventually rise to 15 during the Washington presidency. But these are the most important 4. Who do you think he chose as his Secretary of State? Thomas Jefferson. He chose Thomas Jefferson.